and welcome to session 229 in the AI Safety.com reading group. Tonight we'll be discussing the post on the alignment forum called "The Case for Aligning Narrowly Superhuman Models" by Ajay Kotra. We've seen some previous work by Ajay Kotra, her work on AI timelines and explaining iterated distillation and amplification. Currently, she's a senior research analyst at Open Philanthropy. And this blog post is from March this year, and we will go through Miri's comments on this almost certainly in the next session, but not this day. So, aligning narrowly superhuman models. Let's start with the beginning. What is a model? Well, in machine learning, we usually have some algorithms that are trained on some data, and then we obtain some kind of model that we use for taking actions or predictions and this kind of thing. In this case, we're talking about superhuman models. I'm not entirely sure I like the word superhuman in this case, because we also care about capabilities that are strictly below the superhuman level, and we also care about those that are at roughly the human level, at expert human level, and at a level where humans can't even evaluate. We are talking about narrow models, so something like playing Go would be an example of a very narrow model. But some of these techniques we're talking about are actually surprisingly general, like give advice. So narrow shouldn't be interpreted in too narrow a sense, if you get what I mean. And then finally, aligning. That's what we're trying to do, to figure out how these models can be used to their full potential to do what we actually want. An example would be if someone goes to GPT-3 and say, I am sick, I have these symptoms, what should I do? In this case, GPT-3 has some knowledge about this because it has digested a lot of information from doctors, and it might actually be able to reason that the specific disease is tuberculosis or whatever, but it doesn't want to tell us that. Instead, it wants to play a game where you have this improvisation game where it's just trying to predict the next word, because that's what the GPT-3 actually cares about. So the main objective of this kind of research is to figure out how to give the best advice when we know less than the model about what the real advice is, and also to have some kind of systematic way of figuring out whether the model is doing the best it can. So why is this good? Well, a big reason why this kind of research is something to be optimistic about is because we are actually doing the thing that we want to be really good at, just in a smaller sense. So we want to be really good at aligning strongly, broadly general superhuman models, and aligning narrow models are kind of the same thing. We'll get a lot of practice on doing the thing that we actually want to get good at. And on the outside view, that's a really likely that this experience will be helpful. So we take a big alignment project and we scale it down, and then we try to find some small solutions for this problem. So an example of a narrowly superhuman model would be something like AlphaGo 0, but that's not really an interesting point of view. From an alignment point of view, this is really interesting because you can just specify the objective really simply. It's just to win at Go, and we care about the ones where we sometimes distinguish between the outer alignment problem and the inner alignment problem. In this case, the outer alignment problem is very easy for AlphaGo 0, and we want something that is more fuzzy where we can't write it down. So we need some kind of human feedback. So in general, a way to generate a project from this in this general area is to choose some kind of fuzzy domain. Something where we have some kind of intuition or expectation that the language models we have are in fact superhuman right now. We just can't get that out of them yet. Then we want to have some kind of, to design a reward learning scheme where we find a way to train the AI that allows us to reach above the level of the trainers. And then once we have done that, we need to see that this is actually something that will continue to scale, and something that will also work when we get to bigger models, with the ones that we actually want to end up aligning. So we can't just hard code knowledge or something like that. And then finally, once we have these models, we need to look into pathologies, ways that sometimes the models do wrong things. Maybe they start to lie or something like that. And we need to understand that and ensure they don't lie. So the example Jaya gives of something that is close to this is the paper by Paul Cristiano, Learning to Summarize from Human Feedback. It's not just Paul Cristiano, it's from OpenAI. And this almost follows this formula, but not quite, in that the fuzzy domain of summarizing is somewhat easier, and some of these the paper also don't quite get as far into as we want. Oops. So what kind of projects fit into this agenda and which don't? It's not binary really, but some things that means that it count more is if we're doing something like fine-tuning an existing large model, because that's where we expect this capability to actually reside. It needs to be funky enough that we are dealing with humans, and it needs to be something that is genuinely helpful. On the other hand, if you have an obvious training signal, either just something you can specify or algorithmically code, then it probably doesn't fit into this agenda. If you only optimize for usefulness and nothing else, and no generality, then it also probably doesn't count. And if you just work on doing the model larger, then that doesn't count either within this agenda. Ajaya says that actually making the model larger is not always a negative thing. Sometimes it can be positive, and she believes it's rather complicated. I'm not quite sure I agree with this. I think obviously we can't go out and say it is always evil, because that would imply that OpenAI is evil, and that's probably neither true nor helpful to say. But on the other hand, I don't really think it's a very complicated question, in that I believe that under almost all non-trivial circumstances, making the model larger is negative. So a particular near-term project that could just about be done right now is one that she terms sandwiching. So that's one where the model is decidedly not superhuman right now, because we have one layer where the humans are more capable than the model, and then we have a model, and under that we have some other group of humans who are less capable than the model. And the idea of the sandwiching project is to figure out how to help the lower part of the sandwich, the people who are less capable, train the model to be as good as the more capable humans. And this is of course also something that will help us out in that the models are improving, and it might be possible to even go above what the more capable humans have in some way. So how does this reduce long-term existential risk from AI safety? Well, this is basically what we want to do, just a bit more narrow. So practicing as close as possible to the thing you want to get good at is probably really valuable. And it's likely that since this kind of work will allow us to iterate, then that is likely to be far more effective than doing some of the other conceptual research can be a bit pie in the sky, in that you don't get feedback on whether these things are actually working, since you don't actually have a model to work with. That's also likely to help us. We might see some of the pathologies earlier. The treacherous turn would be a prominent example of something that we could see before it gets really bad. Doing this project will give us some the alignment community as a whole, some know-how about how to deal with this, and some infrastructure, some organization, some community. And the hope is that if all the models, that if we succeed on mostly aligning the relatively weak models we have now, then once we actually get superhuman general intelligences, we will have much more ability to align them, since we've practiced so much. And of course, if we discover a potential solution or maybe the real solution, then we will be able to have a number of test cases to see if we believe that this is a full general solution, then we'll be able to see, does it work in these kind of specific cases. We might also see something that looks conventionally impressive. At this point in the post, Kotra writes this as only a positive thing, and I thought that was a very dangerous thing, that we could see conventionally impressive results in demos. Later she clarifies that this could actually also be a problem, but there are definitely upsides. Like if alignment researchers can show something that is really impressive, then that is good for their careers and good for the field of alignment. So why not do other kinds of alignment research? In Ajay Kotra's model, she divides other kinds of research into conceptual research, some grid worlds and gains, and mainstream machine learning safety. And compared to this, she believes that aligning narrowly superhuman models is more real, meatier, and also more tractable. So, for instance, the grid worlds and gains are usually very small in that, and that can give some bad habits for how you look into whether it's doing something good or bad, because if the model is small enough, then the researcher can actually see that directly, and we need some more indirect methods for working with AIs that are potentially smarter than us. So in this case, we will get some discipline in that we already at this point have to use some methods that need to scale beyond what we can truly just directly. This is also a kind of research where progress seems much more legible, in that conceptual research in particular can be very, very illegible. So that's another reason to pursue this kind of research. The growth potential is also very large, in that you could imagine if this is really successful, then the task of aligning these models could be a big part of the work that eventually goes into making these large models. We can also have more people involved in this, in that if you consider conceptual research, like working at the Machine Intelligence Research Institute, would be something that not many people can do. I believe actually that MIRI already have sufficient funding and just have a really hard time finding people who have the specific taste or intuition for how to do this kind of conceptual research. And I think it might just be a fact of the world that most people can't do that. Whereas aligning narrowly superhuman models might be far more possible. Mainstream machine learning safety is very technical and mathematically dense. And if, as we expect, they are actually not really considering the real problems, then having the alignment community becoming larger is another reason why that's good. So what kind of skills and tasks are required to align narrowly superhuman models? Well, a lot of software engineering and machine learning engineering needs to take place. We need to have a lot of work dealing with humans, in that human feedback is likely to be an essential part of it. And there will be a lot of problems that are hard work, but doesn't require the very best minds in some way. Ajay's intuition is that if we have proper institutions for getting people up to speed on this and sufficient funding, then it might be possible for someone who doesn't really know much about AI safety, but is strong on in software engineer, to start working productively with this within a half to a full year or something like that. Ajay lists a number of possible objections and responses to these objections. The first is, how would this address the treacherous turn? And she admits that she's quite uncertain, and this is a weakness of this research agenda, that it doesn't explicitly address this. There are many research agendas which does not. For instance, mainstream machine learning safety doesn't really help either. There are some ways it could help. We can imagine that transparency would be a part of alignment, and in that case, that's something that would help. We might see mini treacherous turns somewhere, in particular if we go looking for them, which is something that could be a big part of this particular research agenda. And of course, if we build some institutions that work hard with these kind of problems, then having those ready when the first mini treacherous turns happen will be very beneficial. Doesn't this feel suspiciously close to just profit maximizing? Well, somewhat, but there are a number of key differences. For instance, if the most cost-effective thing to do is to make the models bigger, which it seemed to be in many cases, then fine-tuning them might be, and trying to align them, might not be the most commercially valuable thing to do. We are not trying to find the easiest problem that we can, but rather the ones where this research agenda fits best, where alignment is most interesting. We want to have some very general models, even if domain-specific techniques are available. So that's another reason why this differs from just profit maximizing. So we want to have a community where most people who are doing this work is doing it for altruistic reasons, and this is legible to onlookers and things like that. So if we are closely but not quite optimizing for usefulness, then that doesn't seem obviously neglected, because a lot of people want something that's useful. Well, in Ajaya's estimate, most mainstream machine learning and AI projects are either extremely domain specific, or they're focused on just scaling big generic models. So this kind of thing in between that we want to do might be somewhat neglected still. An example would be the Paul Cristiano paper, Learning to Summarize from Human Feedback, which was Paul Cristiano is obviously motivated by long-term existential risk. And that's something that we would not have seen created, or at least not have seen as early created, were it not for this kind of motivation. And it matters a lot who is doing this research and why they're doing this research, not just that it gets done. And right now, the AI safety community has a problem in that there isn't really a very strong community on like mentoring and no built-in audience and no one to like a pipeline for how to get into this kind of technical alignment work. Ajaya says that she strongly suspects that something like this sandwiching is just not being done in any commercial setting. Then there is the objection that this would increase investment in scaling AI. And this was actually quite close to one objection that was raised in the discussion after the previous video last session. So will this increase investment? Well, right now we are seeing investments booming, and we expect this will continue. And since AI is in general much larger than AI alignment, and it's growing faster, Jaya guesses 2 orders of magnitude. And that means that even if adding $1 to the alignment builds up hype, then it needs to build up less than this 100 times as much, according to AI investment, in order for this to shift the balance between capability work and alignment work. And there's a good reason to believe that if this is successful, then this will shift a substantial number of marginal dollars from making the models larger to making them more fine-tuned, if we can show that this actually works. But here Ajaya knows that this kind of research could generate exciting demos, and that's certainly something that is possible and something that potentially could increase investment in scaling AI. So this research agenda could be pared down, right? there is the last part of the project generation formula was to stamp out the pathologies, and why not just focus on that? Well, this is also a valuable thing to do, but this, if we don't have the other alignment paths, then this is basically just robustness reliability work, and this is something that is hard to do in a general sense, in that a lot of reliability work assumes that there is a human judge which at some point can decide whether an action is good or bad. And it's not really neglected. There is a lot of work being done on that, because obviously if you want to build autonomous weapons, then reliability is really important. Fairness, accountability, and transparency is also a heading under which a lot of robustness work is being done. Also, if we want to build a subculture of brand around alignment, then that's a lot easier than just focusing on the same as others are doing, right? So, Ajaya has this sentence: my weak best guess is that it would actually be harder to tell which people working in the robustness space are optimizing for reducing long-term existential risk from AI versus for profit. I think that's probably true, but it's also a very small consideration in my mind. I'm a bit confused about why Ajaya thinks this is really important, because sure, it matters who and why they do the research, but it also matters a lot that the research is being done. So another option we could do instead of this research agenda is to focus on evaluating and testing the existing candidate long-term solution that we already have. For instance, Paul Christiano's agenda. I tried to describe Paul Christiano's agenda really crisply, and I couldn't actually find a really crisp description of Paul Christiano's agenda. Right? We have the iterative distillation and amplification. We have the AI safety via debate. We have a number of these kind of headings, but I haven't actually seen a really crisp description of this agenda. And that might actually be an important problem, because the agendas that we have right now are somewhat in flux. They are not precisely described. There's a lot of people who don't actually really have a good understanding, including me, of precisely what Paul Christiano's end goal is. And there are also other problems with it, in that we might be more interested in finding new solutions rather than testing the ones that we already have. So, what is the current state of opinion on this work? In this section, Jaya describes what other people think about this, which is of course always a bit dangerous, but I think she tries to do it fairly. So, if among people who are alignment researchers working on large models, they are probably really enthusiastic about this, perhaps the best kind of work they personally could do. I think this might be somewhat tautological. Paul Christiano is really optimistic about this because it's so scalable, and that's something that matters a lot to Paul Christiano. People who are working on conceptual research are perhaps less excited about this research agenda than Paul Christiano. Rohin Shah is more optimistic than the Machine Intelligence Research Institute, but still not convinced that this is actually literally the best. Some people are relatively cautiously optimistic, including Eliezer Yudkowsky and Evan Hubinger. We will get more into, in particular, Eliezer Yudkowsky's comments next week. And I should also say that relative optimistic in this case might mean that I expect that Eliezer Yudkowsky believes that most other alignment research is actually wasted. So if this is even being relatively optimistic, that might also be consistent with him saying that this is almost certainly a waste of time. So, what are the takeaways? What are the next steps? Well, Jaya explicitly asks strongly for comments, in particular whether this will be harmful, whether there are other things that might be more interesting, and in particular how to deal with the treacherous turn, because this seems like one of the weaknesses of this particular research agenda, that we don't really have a strong attack on the treacherous turn. She believes that if you are in a position where you can start a project like this, then you should start. And as examples of people who might be able to do this, principal investigator, so the people at university who decide what to research, and senior researchers who have the freedom to just do their own projects, do whatever they want, they should also be able to, people in this kind of situation should basically just start. But open philanthropy is not soliciting grant applications for people who want to do this right now. And they instead say people who might be in a position to do this kind of research in a couple of years should be on the lookout for opportunities, but there are no precise actionable opportunities right now. That is all for today. Thank you and see you next week.